Good morning. Page 302. Had all this taken place 2 years earlier, if only for fear that he would find out, bosses of Stepleg would not have delayed a moment before giving the classic order, "Don't spare the bullets," and shooting the whole crowd penned within these walls. If it had proved necessary to knock off 4,000 or all 8,000, they would not have felt the slightest tremor because they were shock-proof. But the complexity of the situation in 1954 made them vacillate. Even Vavilov, even Botchkov, sensed that a new breeze was stirring in Moscow. Quite a few prisoners had been shot in Kengir already, and they were still wondering how to make it look legal. So a delay was created, which meant time for the rebels to begin their new life of independence. In its very first hours, the political line of the revolt had to be determined, to be or not to be. Should it follow in the wake of the simple-hearted messages scrawled over the columns of the robot press, bash the Czechist boys? As soon as he left the jail and began to take charge, whether through force of circumstances or because of his military skill or on the advice of friends or moved by some inner urge, Captain Ivanovich immediately adopted the line of those Orthodox Soviet citizens who were not very numerous in Kengir and were usually pushed into the background. Cut out all this scribbling of leaflets, nip the evil of counter-revolution in the bud, frustrate those who want to take advantage of events in our camp. These phrases I quote from notes kept by another member of the commission, A.F. Mikhaev, of an intimate discussion in Pyotr Akoyev's storeroom. The Orthodox citizens nodded approval of Kuznetsov. Yes, if we don't stop those leaflets, we shall all get extra time. In the first hours during the night, as he went around all the huts haranguing himself hoarse, again at the meeting, in the mess hall the next morning, and on many subsequent occasions, whenever he encountered extremist sentiments and the bitter rage of men whose lives were trodden so deep into the mire that they felt they had nothing more to lose, Kuznetsov endlessly, tirelessly repeated the same words: "Anti-Sovietism will be the death of us. If we display anti-Soviet slogans, we shall be crushed immediately. They're only waiting for an excuse to crush us. If we put out leaflets like that, they will be fully justified in shooting. Our salvation lies in loyalty. We must talk to Moscow's representatives in a manner befitting the Soviet citizens." Then, in a louder voice, "We shall not permit such behavior on the part of a few provocateurs." However, while he was making these speeches, people on the bunks were loudly kissing. They didn't take in much of what he said. When a train carries you in the wrong direction and you decide to jump off, you have to jump with the motion of the train, not against it. The inertial force of history is just as hard to resist. By no means everyone wanted it that way, but reasonableness of Kuznetsov's line was immediately perceived, and it prevailed. Very soon slogans were hung up all over the camp in big letters, easily legible from the towers in the guardhouse. Long live Soviet Constitution. Long live the Presidium of the Central Committee. Long live the Soviet regime. The Central Committee must send one of its members in and review our cases. Down with the murdering Beryites, wives of Stepleg officers. Aren't you ashamed to be the wives of murderers? Although it was clear as could be to the majority in Kengir that all the millions of acts of rough justice, near and distant, had taken place under the watery sun of that very Constitution, and had been sanctioned by a Politburo consisting of the very same members, all they felt able to do was write "Long live that Constitution and that Politburo." As they reread their slogans, the rebel prisoners now felt themselves on firm legal ground, and began to be less anxious. Their movement was not hopeless. Over the mess hall, where the elections had just taken place, a flag was raised in which the whole settlement could see. It hung there long afterward, white with a black border, and the red hospitalers cross in the middle. In the International Maritime Code, this flag means ship in distress, women and children on board. 12 men were elected to the commission, with Kuznetsov at their head. The members of the commission assumed individual responsibilities and created the following departments. Agitation and propaganda under the Lithuanian Nopkins, who had been sent for punishment from Norilsk after the rising there. Service and maintenance, food, internal security, Gleb Slushenkov. Military, technical, perhaps the most remarkable branch of this camp government. Former Major Mikhaev was made responsible for contacts with the authorities. The commission also had among its members one of the atamans of the thieves, he too was in charge of something. There were also some women, apparently Shakhnovskaya, an economist and party member, already gray, Suprun, an elderly teacher from the Carpathians, and Lubia Bershadskaya. But did the real moving spirits behind the revolt join this commission? It seems that they did not. The centers, especially the Ukrainian center, not more than a quarter of those in the whole camp were Russian, evidently kept themselves to themselves. Mikhail Keller, the Ukrainian partisan, whom from 1941 had fought alternately against the Germans and the Soviet side, and had publicly axed Stuli and Kengir, appeared at meetings of the commission as an observer from the other staff. The commission worked openly in the offices of the Women's Camp Division, but the military department moved its command post field staff out to the bathhouse in Camp Division number 2, the department set for work. The first few days were particularly hectic. There was much planning and arranging to be done. First of all, they had to fortify their position. Mikhail, in expectation of the inevitable military action to crush them, was against creating defenses of any kind, but Slushenkov and Nopkins insisted. Great piles of mud bricks had risen where the breaches in the inner walls were widened and cleared. Where the breaches in the inner walls were widened and cleared, they used these bricks to make barricades facing all the guard points, exits from within, entrances from without, which remained in the hands of the jailers, and any one of which might open at any minute to admit the punitive force. There were plenty of coils of barbed wire in the service yard. With this they made entanglements and scattered them about the threatened approaches. Nor did they omit to put out little boards saying, "Danger, minefield." This was one of the first of the technical department's bright ideas. The department's work was surrounded by great secrecy. In the occupied service yard of the technical department, set aside secret premises with a skull and crossbones drawn on the door, and in the legend, high tension, 100,000 volts. Only the handful of men who worked there were allowed in. so that even the prisoners did not get to know what the technical department's activities were. A rumor was very soon put about that it was making secret weapons of a chemical nature. Since both sects and bosses knew very well what clever engineers there were in the camp, it was easy for a superstitious conviction to get around that they could do anything, even invent a weapon, which no one had yet thought of in Moscow. As for making a few miserable mines, using the reagents which were there in the service yard, what was to stop them? So the boards saying minefield were taken seriously. Another weapon was devised, boxes of ground glass at the entrance to every hut to throw into the eyes of Tommy gunners. The teams were kept just as they had been, but were now called platoons, while the huts were called detachments, and detachment commanders were named subordinate to the military department. Mikhail Keller was put in charge of all guard duties. Vulnerable places were occupied, according to a precise roster, by pickets which were reinforced for the night hours. A man will not run away, and in general will show more courage in the presence of a woman. With this masculine psychological trait in mind, the rebels organized mixed pickets. Besides the many loud-mouthed women in Kengir, there proved to be many brave ones, especially among the Ukrainian girls, who were the majority in the women's camp. Without waiting this time for the master's kind permission, they began taking the window bars down themselves. For the first 2 days, before the bosses thought of cutting the power supply to the camp, the lathes were still working in the shops, and they made a large number of pikes from these window bars by grinding down and sharpening their ends. The smiths and the lathe operators worked without a break in those first few days, making weapons, knives, halberds, and sabers, which were particularly popular with the thieves. They decorated the hilts with jingles and colored leather. Others were seen with bludgeons in their hands. The pickets shouldered pikes as they went to take up their posts for the night. The women's platoon on their way at night to rooms provided in the men's camp, so that they could rush out to meet the attackers if the alarm was raised. It was naively assumed that the butchers would be ashamed to hurt women, also bristled with pikes. All this would have been impossible, would have been ruined by mockers or lectures, if the stern and cleansing wind of rebellion had not been blowing through the camp. In our age, these pikes, these sabers were children's toys, but for these people, prison behind them and prison before them, was no game. The pikes were playthings, but this was what fate had sent, their first chance to defend their freedom, in the puritanical air of that revolutionary springtime, when the presence of women on the barricades itself became a weapon. Men and women behaved with proper dignity, and with dignity carried their pikes, pointing skyward. If anyone during those days entertained hopes of vile orgies, it was the blue epauletted bosses on the other side of the fence. Their calculation was that, left alone for a week, the prisoners would drown in their debauchery. That was the picture they had painted for the inhabitants of the settlement, prisoners mutinying for the sake of sexual indulgence. Obviously, there was no other lack they could feel in their comfortable existence. The main hope of the authorities was that the thieves would start raping women, and the politicals would intervene, and that there would be a massacre. But once again, the MVD psychologists were wrong, and we ourselves may well be surprised. All witnesses agree that the thieves behaved like decent people, but in our sense of the term, not in their own traditional sense. On their side, the politicals and the women themselves emphasized by their behavior that they regarded the thieves as friends and trusted them. What lay below these attitudes need not concern us here. Perhaps the thieves kept remembering their comrades bloodily murdered that first Sunday. If we can speak of the strength of the Kengir revolt at all, its strength was in this unity. Nor did the thieves touch the food stores, which, for those who had known them, is no less surprising. Although there was enough food for many months in the storerooms, the Commission, after due consideration, decided to leave the allowances of bread and other foodstuffs as before. The honest citizen's fear of eating more than his share of public victuals, and having to answer for his waste, as though the state owed the prisoners nothing for all those hungry years. On the other hand, as Mikhaev recalls, when there was a shortage outside the camp, the supply section of the camp administration asked the prisoners to release certain foodstuffs. There was some fruit intended for those higher norms, pre-workers, and the Zeks released it. The camp bookkeepers allocated foodstuffs on the old norms. The kitchen took them and cooked them, but in the new revolutionary atmosphere did not pilfer, nor did emissaries from the thieves appear with instructions to bring the stuff for the people. Nothing extra was ladled out for the trustees, and it was suddenly found that though the norms were the same, they were noticeably more to eat. If the thieves sold things previously stolen in other places, they did not, as had been their custom, immediately come along to take them back again. Things are different now, they said. The stalls belonging to the local workers' supply department went on trading inside the camp. The staff guaranteed the safety of the cashier, a free woman. She was allowed into the camp and went around the stalls with two girls, collecting takings in vouchers from the salespeople. But the vouchers, of course, soon ran out, and the bosses did not let new stocks through the camp. The supply of 3 items needed in the camp remained in the hands of the bosses: electricity, water, and medicine. They did not, of course, control the air supply. As for medicines, they gave the camp not a single powder nor a single drop of iodine in 40 days. The electricity they cut after 2 or 3 days. The water supply they left alone. The technical department began a fight for light. Their first idea was to fix hooks into 2 fine wires and sling them forcibly over the outside cable, which ran just beyond the camp wall. In this way, they stole current for a few days until the tentacles were discovered and cut. This had given the technical department time to try out a windmill and abandon it, and began installing in the service yard, in a spot concealed from prying eyes of the towers, or low-flying observation planes, a hydroelectric station, worked by a water tap. A motor which had to be in the yard was converted into a generator, and they started supplying the camp telephone network, the lighting and staff headquarters, and the radio transmitter. The huts were lit with wood splint. This unique hydroelectric station went on working till the last day of the revolt. In the very early days of the mutiny, the generals would come into the camp as though they owned it. True, Kuznetsov was not at a loss. When the first parley took place, he ordered his men to bring the bodies from the morgue, and loudly ordered caps off. The Zeks bared their heads, and generals, too, had to take off their peaked caps in the presence of their victims, but the initiative remained with Gulag's General Bajkov. After approving the election of a commission, "You can't talk to everybody at once," he demanded that negotiators tell him first how their cases had been investigated, and Kuznetsov began lengthily and perhaps eagerly presenting his story, and further insisted the prisoners should stand up to speak. When somebody said the prisoners demand, Bajkov touchily retorted that prisoners cannot demand, they can only request, and the prisoners' request became the established formula. Sorry. Chekhov replied to the prisoners' request with a lecture on the building of socialism, the unprecedentedly rapid progress of the economy, and the success of the Chinese Revolution. This complacent irrelevancy that driving screws into the brains which always leaves us weak and numb. He had come to the camp to look for evidence that the use of firearms had been justified. They would shortly declare that in fact there had been no shooting in the camp, that it was just a lie told by the gangsters, nor had there been any beatings. He was simply amazed they should dare to ask him to infringe the instruction concerning the separate housing of men and women prisoners. They talked this way about their instructions as though they were laws for and from all time. Shortly, other more important generals arrived in Douglas aircraft. Dolgeek, at the time allegedly head of Gulag, and Yegorov, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs of the USSR. A meeting was called in the mess hall, and some 200 prisoners assembled. Kuznetsov gave the orders, "Silence, please all stand, attention," and respectfully invited the generals to sit on the dais, while he, as befitted his subordinate rank, stood to one side. Suchenkov behaved differently. When one of the generals casually spoke of enemies present, Suchenkov answered in a clear voice, "How many of your sort turned out to be enemies? Yagoda was a public enemy. Yezhov was a public enemy. Abakumov was a public enemy. Beria was a public enemy. How do we know that Kruglov is any better?" Makeyev, to judge from his notes, drew up a draft agreement in which the authorities promised not to transfer people to other camps or otherwise victimize them, and to begin a thorough investigation, while the Zeks in return agreed to return to work immediately. However, when he and his supporters started going around the huts and asking prisoners to accept his draft, they were jeered at as bald-headed Komsomol's procurement agents and lackeys of the Cheka. They got particularly hostile reception in the women's camp, and found that the separation of the men's and women's divisions was by now the last thing the Zeks would agree to. Makeyev angrily answered his opponents, "Just because you've had your hand on some wench's tits, you'd think the Soviet government is a thing of the past. The Soviet regime will get its own way, whatever happens." The days ran on. They never took their eyes off the campgrounds. Soldiers' eyes from the towers and warders' eyes too. The warders, knowing the Zeks by sight, were supposed to identify them and remember who did what. And even the eyes of airmen, perhaps equipped with cameras, and the generals were regretfully forced to conclude that there was no massacres, no pogroms, no violence in there, that the camp was not disintegrating of its own accord, and that there was no excuse to send in troops to the rescue. The camp stood fast, and the negotiations changed their character. Golden epauletted personages in various combinations continued coming into camp to argue and persuade. They were all allowed in. They had to pick up white flags, and between the outer gate of the service guard, now the main entrance, and the barricade, they had to undergo a body search, with some Ukrainian girls slapping the general's pockets in case there was a pistol or a hand grenade inside them. In return, the rebel staff guaranteed their personal safety. They showed the generals around wherever it was allowed. Not, of course, around the secret sector of the service yard. Let them talk to prisoners, and called big meetings in the camp division for their benefit. Their epaulets flashing, the bosses took their seats in the presidium as of old, and thought nothing were amiss, as though nothing were amiss. Okay, I gotta stop there. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.